The 9 o'clock news and campaign report, first on BBC One with Peter Sissons.
A defeat in Luxembourg over cuts in fishing draws a pledge of defiance from John Major and scorn from Tony Blair. Mr Blair says Mickey Mouse could get a better deal for Britain's fishermen. The government says Labour would sell them down the river. Fire at a massive pilgrim camp in Saudi Arabia kills more than 180 and leaves 800 hurt. And BT shareholders vote yes to the massive takeover which makes it the second biggest player in world communications. Good evening. A crucial deal for Britain's fishermen went against the government today and opened a new front in the election hostilities. After Britain lost the vote on fishing cuts at a meeting in Luxembourg, John Major promised that the reductions, designed to preserve fish stocks, wouldn't be implemented until he won his battle to stop so-called quota hopping, the means by which foreign boats take part of Britain's ration of fish. He said the Europeans had passed something by qualified majority voting that ought not to have been passed. Tony Blair said the Tories were so divided on Europe, Mickey Mouse could have got a better deal. Paddy Ashdown said the government was legally bound to implement the decision. Our political editor, Robin Oakley, reports.
Facing cutbacks in catches of 30% over 5 years, following the Fisheries Council decision, the crews leaving Plymouth Harbour tonight cannot have been optimistic about their long-term prospects. But the government is insisting Britain won't implement any cuts until the problem of so-called quota hopping, foreign-owned boats registered in Britain taking up more than a quarter of the fish catch allowed, has been resolved. The Prime Minister was defiant.
We believe the common fisheries policy isn't working properly. We believe the way quota hopping is working is not what was intended when the original agreement was reached. And I have not a shred of intention of cutting the British catch until or unless we get a satisfactory agreement on quota hopping.
Mr Major said he'll block negotiations on Europe's future constitution until quota hopping is resolved. But the fisheries decision has pushed Europe to the forefront of the election campaign. Labour's leader, who hasn't ruled out similar blocking action, argued that Tory divisions on Europe made them weak negotiators.
This is yet another failure. First beef, then fish. They talk tough, they get nothing done because they're hopelessly divided. And the Labour government would get a better deal for the British fishing industry. Mind you, Mickey Mouse would get a better deal than this one.
Have a look at the 9 o'clock news tonight and you might find yourself on there.
The Liberal Democrats leader, making some young friends while wooing farmers in Devon, said the government was legally bound to accept the fishing decision and would fail on fish as it had in the beef war.
The right way to approach all this is to scrap the common fisheries policy altogether, to deal with all of these issues in an urgent review of the common fisheries policy and replace it with a regional policy. The Prime Minister has decided on bluster. For the purposes of the election, we all know what will happen. He'll back down straight afterwards if he gets elected, which he won't, because fishermen don't trust him any more than farmers do.
£500 steak, we'll go for it on, all right? That's right.
The Scottish National Party leader, who today had a hefty bet on his party winning more than 7 seats, said the government was doing too little, too late.
For 10 years, the Tory government have allowed this disgraceful situation to develop, allowed the quota hoppers to dominate the sea, and now John Major says that after the election he's going to sort it out. I don't think there's a single fisherman, north or south of the border, has any confidence in a Tory guarantee.
The parties are stepping delicately over Europe, but not so Dame Angela Rumbold, a Tory party vice-chairman, who confirmed her outright opposition to a single European currency. Had she been a minister, such a display of the party's divisions would have earned her the sack. But she insists she still believes in the government keeping its options open.
I'm very fully supportive of the government's position. I understand perfectly why the government has to have a clear run to be able to do the negotiations. I just think it's important that my constituents who keep asking me know what I believe.
Mr Major said Dame Angela was free to make her opinions known.
She's a backbencher. She's not a member of the government. Like every other backbencher, she's entitled to express her views on an issue that may or may not come to fruition in unknown circumstances at an unknown time in the future.
But another former Tory vice-chairman, these days on the Liberal Democrats' top table, was scathing.
She's a loose cannon on the deck of a sinking ship. Not to back the party leader is inconceivable. It shows that Major and Mawhinney and Angela Rumbold are running three separate streams of activity. It's extraordinary.
The degree of confusion over Europe among the Tories would be comic if it wasn't that these are people who pretend to be the government of Britain. What Britain desperately needs is a government that will fight Britain's corner in Europe, not fight itself.
The real dread for the Tories is that a minister will break ranks as Dame Angela has done. And one well-known cabinet Eurosceptic this morning, asked if he could imagine voting for a single currency, revealed the tension with a less than enthusiastic response.
I have such a fertile imagination, I can imagine almost anything.
Tory fault lines are showing once more, but Labour's first single currency rebel emerged today as well. And there's a problem for European leaders too. Their worry is a British general election which becomes ever more Eurosceptical, with whoever gets elected having left themselves no room for manoeuvre in negotiations. With Labour coming under pressure to match Tory pledges of non-cooperation, the prospect of such an outcome is increasing. Robin Oakley, BBC News, Westminster.
I'm joined now from Brussels by our Europe correspondent James Robbins. James, how real were these fishing negotiations? Was Britain ever going to get anywhere in the middle of an election campaign?
They were real in the sense that, of course, as a result of this vote and only France backing Britain in opposition to deep cuts in fishing, the cuts are now agreed, they will have legal force, and Britain will be judged to be in breach of its EU commitments if it doesn't carry them out, whatever the Prime Minister says. However, the issue of quota hopping couldn't be settled at these talks. That has to wait for the intergovernmental conference after the election.
Do you detect among our European partners any unease at the election rhetoric here? Mr. Blair, too, has said that he wouldn't hesitate to disrupt proceedings at the Amsterdam summit if it was in Britain's interests.
No, there is a deep worry. The Dutch government, currently chairing EU business, was predicting way back in December at the previous summit in Dublin that there was a real danger of what they saw as competitive Euroscepticism during what they would regard as a damaging campaign from Europe's point of view. And now they take no pleasure in saying that they see their predictions coming true. They see a hardening of attitude on the Labour side over the national veto, over the single currency, and now over quota hopping. Although I'm bound to say that only last month Robin Cook here in Brussels was making clear that quota hopping would not be an issue which he would see being used by Britain to block the intergovernmental conference on Europe's future.
And very briefly, any fear among our European partners that perhaps we're in for a long haul of British Euroscepticism, whatever the outcome of the election, with an increasingly Eurosceptic electorate and perhaps many more Eurosceptic MPs?
There is certainly a growing realisation throughout mainland Europe that British politics as a whole has shifted to a more Eurosceptic position, but I think the jury's still out on what a Labour government, if one were to be elected, would mean in practice. There is a sense that a relationship with an incoming Labour government, if that were to be the outcome of the election, could be much more positive, particularly with the baggage of the beef war thrown overboard. Most of all, Britain's European partners want to see a strong government with a strong majority. What they don't want is a government they see being led from the backbenches.
James Robbins, thank you. The political parties have clashed again over the future of education. The Deputy Prime Minister, Michael Heseltine, launched a personal attack on Tony Blair, calling him a hypocrite, claiming he sent one of his sons to a grant-maintained school but would deny others the same chance. Mr. Blair said at least his children went to state schools and described the attack as desperate stuff. Our political correspondent, John Pienaar, reports.
Another warm welcome for Tony Blair, a touch stage-managed, but that's what campaigning is all about. Tony Blair wants to be seen rising above the slanging match, fighting clean and talking policy. He's casting the Tories as the villains of the piece.
I'll tell you this, you know, they've been having a bit of a go at me. Dr. Mawhinney and Mr. Heseltine, even Mr. Major. But it doesn't matter how many insults they hurl at me, or at you, or any of the good people here today. What matters is setting out how we can make this country better and give our young people the future that they need. That's what matters in this election campaign.
Kissing babies is always a positive image, and better education was chosen as a positive message. Today, the party promised action zones where school standards were poor. Specialist schools would help raise standards.
Standards, more than structure, is what counts. All children can and must learn effectively. The failure of schools is no longer acceptable.
No apologies at Tory headquarters for the way they're attacking Labour's leader as well as Labour policy. They mocked him for opposing grant-maintained schools, then sending his son to one. But that raised a familiar question.
Why should the country continue to trust with the education system a cabinet, the vast majority of whose members send their children for private education, when 95% of the country must rely on state education?
Well, I think the great difficulty for Tony Blair is because he comes from a public school himself. He really doesn't understand the state education system. He takes advantages.
My children go to state schools. Most of them send their children to private schools.
Paddy Ashdown wants to tap into public disapproval of the daily scrap.
I think there's a sharp differentiation between legitimate criticism based on policy and record and the kind of high-pressure, hugely expensive, negative campaigning imported from the United States.
The Tories have been arguing again that Labour's sums don't add up, and the themes of this election are as familiar now as the tactics. Today, Tony Blair allowed himself to speak of victory. Labour's growing more confident, but this campaign's not over yet, and nor clearly is the political infighting. John Pienaar, BBC News, Westminster.
And that's the news from the campaign trail for the moment. There'll be more later in the programme. But now, the rest of the day's news. Saudi state raid. But first, over to our political correspondent Anne Perkins at our Westminster campaign desk for her nightly election roundup.
Evening, Peter. The assembled media at the party's morning news conferences don't always get answers, mainly because follow-up questions are considered out of order. Politicians swiftly move on. At the Tory conference this morning, Mr Heseltine smoothly brushed aside a question about whether he still had ambitions to be Prime Minister, and Peter Lilly ducked questions about Europe.
Michael Prescott from the Sunday Times.
Peter Lilly is one of only two cabinet ministers who won't face a referendum party candidate. No one apparently doubts his Eurosceptic credentials. So when Michael Heseltine denounced politicians who don't tell the whole truth, it seemed an ideal opportunity to get Mr Lilly on the record on Europe.
Peter Lilly, can you foresee any circumstances under which you would ever vote in favour of a single currency?
I have such a fertile imagination, I can imagine almost anything.
Further attempts to persuade him to clarify his position failed. So, in the interests of the whole truth, we followed him onto the campaign trail in search of an answer to the question, what is his personal position on a single currency? I mean, can you imagine a single currency? No, I won't say can you imagine, because you'll say you've got a very fertile imagination. But I do not see how a single currency could not involve a transfer of sovereignty.
Well, you're entitled to your views.
Do you agree?
I've said that we are not going to close off options while we're still negotiating.
Would you accept?
And you're inviting me to do so.
Would you accept a single currency if it did involve a loss of sovereignty?
And then you're asking me to answer hypothetical questions which may not arise and which we don't need to answer until we've settled. We as a government don't. I can understand backbench MPs wanting to express their views and candidates expressing their views, but the people of this country expect a government to negotiate to get the best deal for Britain.
And that's what he told anyone who asked. Are you happy with Mr Lilly's explanation? I am. You don't feel you should know what his personal position is?
Well, I would like to know.
Well, obviously, I'm personally a member of the government, and I have collective responsibility with my fellow ministers for these negotiations and for getting it right in Britain's interests.
When Mr Lilly publishes his election address next week, things may become a little clearer. There are 3 polls tonight. They're broadly in line with most of the other polls in the campaign so far, though Murray's poll for today's London Evening Standard hasn't repeated a rise for the Conservatives suggested in their previous poll in the middle of last week. Murray interviewed people across the country between last Friday and yesterday. It puts Labour on 50% up 1, the Conservatives are on 29% down 5, and the Liberal Democrats 15 up 3. Unlike the other pollsters, Murray doesn't adjust its figures to take into account the apparent reluctance of some people to say they support the Conservatives. ICM for tomorrow's Guardian has Labour on 45, down 1 on the last ICM poll, the Conservatives at 31, down 3, and the Liberal Democrats on 19, up 4. ICM interviewed people on Sunday and Monday. Gallup for tomorrow's Daily Telegraph suggests that Labour are on 51, up a couple of points on the previous survey for the Sunday Telegraph. The Conservatives at 30, down 3, and the Liberal Democrats unchanged at 12. Gallup interviewed people from Saturday afternoon until today. The Ulster Unionist, the largest party in Northern Ireland, has launched its manifesto. The party says it wants to reach a political settlement with the other constitutional parties and is in favour of a Bill of Rights and a new assembly for the province. But it said Sinn Féin was irredeemable in its present form. Science and technology has always been high on New Labour's agenda. This afternoon they spoke of a brain gain as they predicted that scientists would want to return to a Blair-run Britain. So it's fitting that for a leader who sings the praises of the internet, he's running a campaign that's strong on gadgetry.
For Mr Major, a soapbox. For Mr Blair, something a little grander in Crawley today. But actually a simple walkabout like this hides a battery of high-tech equipment being used by Labour. For example, a cordless microphone clipped to Mr Blair's tie.
Oh, I'm getting kissed all over the place here. I'll come again.
That radio mic overcomes the problems of having Mr Blair in a big and busy crowd because it sends the sound of his voice back and the voices of reporters and members of the public who he's speaking to this aerial here. And then it goes down a wire to a mixing desk supplied by the Labour Party. What this arrangement means is that film crews don't need to use their own microphones, and so they can be prevailed on to keep their cameras at a distance so they don't get in the way of pictures of Mr Blair.
In the end, then you've got your job to do. I've got to get the best pictures for a while.
Here, a TV producer is trying to get permission from Labour staff to take certain pictures.
As long as everyone else behaves themselves. So I'll go and talk to them now, but as long as you're happy, or not unhappy, that we're walking in front of them.
Yeah, as long as you're, reasonably discreet.
Well, you have to be.
That wasn't the case here.
Come on, out.
These two party officials pulled back a cameraman who'd got too close, only to discover he was working for Labour. And he's not the only one. Hoisted by someone positioned at the back of the crowd, this mini camera bobs around mysteriously overhead, taking pictures for party use.
Work or opportunity in our society.
Sometimes the forward-looking technology has drawbacks. In Maidstone, a metal gantry interfered with the microphone. And then at Hillsborough Football Ground, the earpiece Mr Blair wore for a Labour-organised link-up prompted Conservatives to say he needed it to hear emergency advice from his aides.
For many of these children...
The height of the technology matches the aspirations, of course, but for all the parties, the irony is that so much equipment should be necessary simply to get closer to the people. Jeremy Vine, BBC News.
And that's it from us for tonight. Back to you in the studio, Peter.
And Perkins. Throughout the campaign, we've been reporting on the campaign issues up and down the country. Tonight, we're in the southwest of England, a region which stretches from Cornwall to Gloucester. The southwest is largely dependent on a few key industries. 22% of the population work in the defence industry, including Westland Helicopters at Yeovil and shipbuilding at Devonport. More than 3.5% work in agriculture, which has been badly affected by the BSE crisis. Tourism is important throughout the region, with last year an 11% increase in overseas tourists. The fishing industry has seen a drop in the number of fishing boats, hit by European efforts to preserve stocks by reducing catches. Unemployment is 2% below the national average at 6.3%, but there are regional differences, with almost twice as many jobless in Cornwall as in Wiltshire. Average earnings at £327 a week are just lower than the rest of Britain, but again there are variations, with Cornish workers the worst off. Michael Burke is in Plymouth, in the heart of the southwest.
As you say, Peter, the wealth represented by the boats here at the Royal Western Yacht Club is not spread evenly across the region. The clotted cream prosperity of the lush country to the north of here gives way to poverty as bad as Portugal down in Cornwall. One issue, though, seems to bother all of these counties and their constituencies: Europe. The traditional industries, fishing and farming, blame Europe for their problems, and their concerns are reflected throughout the wider community. Our West of England correspondent Stephen Cape has crossed the wide breadth of this region and taken its pulse.
Don Cameron runs the world's biggest balloon company from Bristol. In the early 80s, he employed just 20. Today, more than 100 work for him, and business is buoyant.
Well, I think everyone's fairly happy with the situation. I think what people in business need more than anything else is stability. And I think things are reasonably stable at the moment, so nobody's complaining too badly.
In the last year, more than 15,000 new businesses started up in this corner of England. But the further southwest you go, the story's not always one of prosperity. Leaving Bristol, you head along the main route to Plymouth and into farming country. With nearly 20% of beef and dairy herds in the southwest, the region has felt the full impact of the BSE crisis. Martin Howlett is taking his cattle to market, even though he stands to lose money. Since the scare, prices at auction have fallen by £150 a head. But he's never had a case of BSE in his herd.
We feel very aggrieved, really. We have lost on our own farm income about £20,000. That was our profit, that was our investment, completely gone.
It's money that'll be difficult to recoup, and Mr. Howlett plans to vent his anger in the ballot box.
I, for one, have always voted Conservative ever since I've been able to, and they have completely let us down as farmers. And I believe that in the long run, that come election day will count, the votes will go against them.
This warehouse near Plymouth is a testament to the BSE crisis. A mountain of brown powder is all that remains of cows slaughtered and then rendered down. Around the country, more than 1 million animals have been killed.
Nick, in tonnage, what do you reckon's here?
At the moment, we're probably in approximately just over 6,000 tonnes just in this shed alone, but that's increasing every day with lorries coming in every day.
And how many cows do you think that represents?
6,000 tonne, it's a lot of cows, but I wouldn't like to estimate it.
Crossing into Cornwall was described recently as falling off an economic cliff. Many traditional industries have gone. Once Cornwall had 2,000 mines. Now only one remains, South Crofty. It was recently saved from closure when local people invested £1 million in its future. But the mine is only just breaking even, and it's facing an uncertain future.
Cornish people got a lot of genuine pride because being the last one, I mean, it goes back in history. There's been so much mining one time with so many people employed, and now we're down to just hundreds. We work hard to keep the place open, very hard. And maybe one day the timber pick up, we'll get the rewards for it. But at the moment it feels as if we're just working for survival, really.
The nearby town of Redruth has been nicknamed Sarajevo by locals because of the state of the town centre. Here unemployment is 10%, twice the average in the West Country. David Darks has been out of work for 2 years.
Since the mines closed, Cornwall, in this area anyway, seems to be going down and down and down.
Tourism, the region's biggest industry, only offers seasonal work, and Cornwall has the greatest proportion of low-paid workers in England.
Wage rates up to £3 an hour. If it's over that, it's a very good job down here.
Do you think you have any chance of getting a job?
Not around here. I think it's time that I've looked anywhere in the country, even abroad, anything to get a job.
And there is yet more disillusionment on the coast.
Southerly, 6 to gale force 8.
The weather forecast is bad.
Southerly 4 to 5.
But skipper Martin Jones has to take the chance.
Well, it's not very smart, but we'll have to go and give it a go. The bank manager would be pleased to hear that anyhow.
Like many fishermen, Martin feels angry that under European law the Spanish have been able to fish in British waters. He feels let down by the government and Europe.
They just haven't bothered about us. I don't think. They certainly haven't stood up for us. They just seem to let the Spanish run all over us. We were betrayed from the word go.
Among fishermen, farmers and miners, there's a feeling of disenchantment. And in the marginal seats in the southwest, the question is, how will this be reflected in the general election?
Stephen Cape reporting. And that question is exercising all the parties here. Labour hope they can benefit from anti-Conservative feeling, but outside the cities, it's the Liberal Democrats who are the main challengers to the Conservatives. After boundary changes are taken into account, the Conservatives are calculated to hold 39 of the region's 51 seats. Labour have 6, and the Lib Dems also have 6. One of their key targets is Torridge and Devon West, the seat previously held by Emma Nicholson, who defected from the Tories to the Lib Dems. She's not standing this time. Those who are finding Europe is the issue which causes the most passionate arguments in the constituency. I spent the day there. Europe's been unpopular in this part of Devon before. Sir Francis Drake, an early Eurosceptic, lived here at Buckland Abbey, just out of sight of the sea where he burned and looted the Spanish Armada. Drake, tourists here today were told, would have known what to do with quota hoppers.
This is where we plan to give the Spanish a bloody nose. And by Timothy, sometimes I feel like I'd like to do it again.
This is a rural constituency, the second largest in England. Cattle farmers have a powerful voice here. After the long BSE row with Europe, that voice is angry and anti-European.
I'll be the first man in the voting booth if there's election or a referendum on Europe.
Why do you feel so strongly?
Because we've just sold down the river.
On this BSE, they've got nothing out of it. With all this colour, they've got nothing out of it at all.
Well, that's right.
Paddy Ashdown arrived here at Hatherley Market this morning, knowing this seat was top of his target list, knowing as leader of the most pro-European of the main parties, he has a circle to square.
Most farmers know that although Europe has been dealt very badly with them as a result of what this government has done, I mean, it's hardly surprising if the government that represents you has spent 18 years making enemies in Europe, and then when they need some friends, they turn around and they haven't got many, and farmers have paid a very, very, very high price for that.
John Major was here too today, in Tavistock, where Sir Francis Drake was born. His audiences here seem to like him talking tough on Europe, enough maybe to save the seat.
It's absolutely fundamental. It doesn't matter where I've been in the southwest, either now or at any time over the past 2 years or so. The people in the southwest simply do not wish what they call a federal Europe. They simply do not wish to have it.
Labour's trailed badly here before, relying on pockets of industry like the shipyard at Appledore, a privatised and now successful business whose owners are outspokenly anti-European. The workers have to decide whether a vote for Labour merely splits the anti-Tory vote.
Wherever we've gone, we've had positive support. People who have supported the Liberals in the past are saying we want a Labour government. The only way we're going to get that is by electing Labour MPs.
Drake's drum is the biggest tourist attraction around here. Beating the anti-European drum may yet keep this, one of the most beautiful constituencies in England, in Tory hands. Nominations close tomorrow. So far, 6 candidates have said they plan to stand in Torridge and Devon West. The West Country has a long Liberal tradition, and Paddy Ashdown's party has a lot at stake here. The question for all the parties, though, is how deep and how pervasive the mood against Europe really is here, and which party will benefit. The danger for the Liberal Democrats is that the party that's most enthusiastic about Europe could well be the loser. Peter.
Thank you, Michael. The main election headline tonight, John Major has said he has no intention of cutting British fish catches, despite a vote by EU fishing ministers. Labour said it was another failure by the government because the Conservatives were hopelessly divided over Europe. Well, joining me now is our political editor, Robin Oakley, with news of a development tonight in that row over Europe. Robin, what's happened?
Well, Peter, I said in my report earlier this evening that the one thing the Tories dreaded was a minister breaking ranks in the same way that Dame Angela Rumbold, a party officer, had done, and coming out in opposition to the single currency. That's what the Tories have been dreading all along. BBC's Newsnight tonight have an exclusive report on the First Minister that we have evidence of doing so. If I show this to the camera, John Horan, the junior health minister, has put in an election report which is sent out to electors in his the constituency he's trying to win, in which he says, "I am opposed to the euro replacing the pound sterling, since this would take away more of our independence." Now that is a clear breach of the line that ministers are expected to keep to, that options have got to be kept open on a single currency, what the government calls its negotiate and decide policy, and which everybody else knows as the wait and see policy.
Will John Major sack him?
I think he will probably have to sack him unless Mr Horam can come up with some very convincing explanation for the use of those words pretty quickly. The Prime Minister and his aides and those about him have been signalling for some time. Ministers have got to keep to this line. Backbenchers have a freedom, ministers don't, and it has been made clear it's a sackable offence.
We saw Peter Lilly earlier grappling with the questions about this. How serious would it be if a cabinet minister were to follow suit, and what's the likelihood of that?
It would be deeply serious if a cabinet minister were to break ranks on this issue. The problem for the Tories all along, the Eurosceptic ministers have said this was a compromise deal that could just about get them up to an election. The danger always was that it wouldn't actually see them through an election. I don't think probably we will see a cabinet minister actually break ranks, even though some of them would be tempted, some of the hardline Eurosceptics, because it would show such disloyalty that certainly any of them who fancy their chances of being a future leader of the party and participating in that kind of contest would draw back from disloyalty at this stage, because they would pay a penalty for that in the party ranks later.
Robin Oakley, thank you. And a reminder, you can see that full story with an interview with John Horam on Newsnight at on BBC 2 at 10:30. That's all from the 9 o'clock news. Good night.